Hi, my name is Winsley, and welcome to my video celebrating 25 years of Age of Wonders. The developers of Age of Wonders recently made this post online about how the first Age of Wonders came out 25 years ago, and I just wanted to take some time to recognize not only that accomplishment that they've been actively working on the franchise for 25 years, but also to talk a little bit more about Age of Wonders 4 and how it compares to Age of Wonders Planetfall and all of the other games that are out there right now. In general, I think Age of Wonders 4 has been very successful, and we will just take some time to read through this. I believe they mentioned that in this text. There isn't too much here, so I actually will do this coverage a little bit differently, and I will just basically read what they had to say celebrating the 25 years of Age of Wonders. After that, I have some other things prepared, like the information about it on Steam, on SteamDB, and just a little bit of a discussion about how I've been making content for about 5 years. So, I've been covering the game for about 20% of its lifespan, or not the game. I've been covering the franchise for about 20% of the time that it's been going for, which I think is really interesting. The time has really flown by for me. I can't imagine what it's like for the people actually actively working on Age of Wonders. So this says that the first game was released 25 years ago in 1999, and it was made by a small group of computer science students who wanted to make a role-playing game on the Epic scope that allowed them to basically role-play. It was a mammoth project for inexperienced developers, took over 6 years, and they had to fully rewrite and finish their including a full rewrite and while they finished their studies and founded the studio. They were supported by Epic Games, and they had a lot of young talent there. They managed to bring the game from their dorms and bedrooms to a global audience, which is pretty impressive for your first game like that. We never imagined this labor of love would be keeping them busy 25 years later. Through each new chapter, Age of Wonders evolved, embracing new technologies, perhaps most importantly, finding a balance between innovation and staying true to the spirit of the original. Yeah, I think the first Age of Wonders game, if you go back and play it, it feels pretty similar because they have heroes, they have tiers of units and a similar progression to win the game. You go and conquer the map, you try and capture cities and take the other players out, but maybe they'll give you some other objectives to try and win the game. They achieve this by welcoming fresh talent to the veteran developers and incorporating invaluable feedback from players like us. Yes, I do think one of the things Triumph Studios does particularly well is taking the feedback that players are giving them and implementing them in their updates. I think Age of Wonders 4 in particular has been very good about that, and I think they really took it up a notch when they made Age of Wonders Planetfall. I think that they were very actively changing things when that game was releasing its DLCs. With each DLC, there would be a giant big free update, and I think prior to that there was less expansions and less free updates, incorporating that player feedback. And then in 2023, with Age of Wonders 4, it became their most successful entry in the series. The delivers the original promise while allowing players to role play just a little bit more than other some of the other previous titles. Age of Wonders 4 is, yeah, the most successful in the franchise's history, proving that some dreams only grow stronger with time. I like that line. We hope to continue supporting for a long time to come. To all the incredible developers and publishing partners, yeah, they're just thanking the people who've helped make things possible. And to the players, they're also thanking us for every Conquest Alliance. We've helped create this universe. Without our passion, loyalty, none of this would have been possible. I love that. I feel like they really see their community and appreciate their community. I noticed that they shouted out Leonard and Arno here, and I also wanted to mention I really am a big fan of Tom Bird. He's not in the listed names here, but I think he's been with the game a long time, and he's like their community person that runs a lot of their streams. So yeah, it's really cool that they're giving these guys shout outs, but I just want to make sure he gets in there because he's one of my favorites over there. Of course, I could mention a Voxel, and I always get this name wrong. It's not Luis, it's Lewis. Lewis is one of the developers who makes a lot of the design decisions. So I wanted to give them all credit, but it's tough. I don't know all the names off the top of my head. and those are the ones that just come to mind first. So anniversary treats, we got a giveaway on the Discord server, which is actually already done. I think it was mostly for the free weekend, which they had right before this celebration, and I think it actually really influenced their numbers and made them look maybe slightly better than they would have if they hadn't done their free weekend. I don't know if that was intentional, if it was just a coincidence, but it's really neat the way things worked out. And then they posted a link to some Ways of War wallpapers, which I put down here in this document. The wallpapers are these four images. I think we've seen a lot of them used in the promotional material, but now let's move on to the discussion about the Steam charts and the Steam top sellers. So I noticed somebody posted on Reddit that Age of Wonders 5 was actually in the top five top sellers over the weekend, and when I checked it more recently, rather, I noticed that it had dropped down quite a bit. I think it was right up here, and there are a lot of free to play games in here that I think aren't really necessarily fair to compare to Age of Wonders. In fact, I probably should have used the filter to get rid of the free to play ones. But you can see that Age of Wonders is relatively close to the top of the list, and games like Civ 6, which generally have sold a lot more games over their lifespan, they aren't appearing in this list. I'm not entirely sure how global top sellers is calculated. I did see a discussion here about and maybe it's done over a day, a week, or like maybe potentially over the past hour. I'm not entirely sure, but I do think it's really interesting that Age of Wonders 4 was able to take this spot for at least a little bit, especially when it's competing against things that are just simply free to play, because those will just get a lot more downloads across the board and be easier to promote. But then again, Age of Wonders 4 just did a little free to play weekend. Who knows how much that actually impacted this ranking. We are now ready to look at SteamDB, the Steam database, to look at the concurrent number of players for Age of Wonders 4 over time. This will give us a better idea how well this game has done compared to previous Age of Wonders games and other games that are relatively similar, like Stellaris is one that I pulled up here, and then we have Civ 6 that we're going to compare these numbers against. So if we go back here, we can see that its all-time peak was 42,000, and that was right when the game first came out. This is pretty normal for video games. Usually you'll see the highest number of concurrent players when the game first comes out, but every once in a while a game like Sid Meier's will be able to deviate from the trends that you typically see with these Steam charts, in that usually a game will get less popular over time, but every once in a while it'll actually get slightly more popular over time. If we look here, this little low point for Civ 6 is actually quite a bit lower than the low points in between DLCs that we're seeing in more recent years, like 2023 and 2024. And when we compare that to Age of Wonders 4, it is not quite following the same trend. It looks like the concurrent number of players is pretty consistently 2,000 to 3,000. We did see a slightly smaller low point after the release of the base game and the first DLC, Dragon Dawn. But in general, I'd say this is pretty normal and pretty much what you'd expect to see in the data. This jump right here is quite abnormal and quite interesting that they were able to get this much many more concurrent players than they normally get. Now, if we take a closer look at this week, we'll see that the DLC coming out on November 5th was not too different from previous DLCs, where it had a peak, a 24-hour peak from the DLC that was about 5,000. And if we go back to this peak, this one went up to 7,000. This one went up to 6,000. We had some other peaks that were close to 7,000. So in a weird way, I think Ways of War may not have been as popular as it may look as at an initial glance, but um, there could be some extra factors in here that we're not taking into consideration. Like these peaks might actually be from the weekend after the DLC came out, not from the day that the DLC comes out, because the DLCs typically do come out on Tuesdays, and I know a lot of people like to play these games over the weekend. The next chart we're going to take a little look at is the Planetfall Steam DB, and we're going to just take a little comparison between the numbers that we see here and the numbers that we see on the Age of Wonders 4 chart. Specifically, I think it's really interesting that Age of Wonders Planetfall's highest number of concurrent players is 10,000 players, and that's lower than the peak we saw this past weekend. This past weekend had up to almost 16,000 players playing Age of Wonders 4, and that is more than the number of people that were just playing Age of Wonders Planetfall when it came out on day one. None of the DLCs that came out for Age of Wonders Planetfall were able to accomplish anything like the peaks that we're seeing for any of the previous DLCs for Age of Wonders 4. But even when we take that into consideration, I think the biggest deviation is the fact that we got such a high peak here for Age of Wonders 4, and we never saw anything quite like that for Age of Wonders Planetfall. They never did a free to play weekend that was able to reinvigorate interest in the game, and this makes me hopeful for Age of Wonders 4 moving forward. I really, really hope that the game continues to sell well and do well, and that we get more content after the next planned DLCs. We've got, I think, Giant Kings coming out next year, and Archon Prophecies, I believe, is supposed to come out a few months after Giant Kings. It's possible that could be the final DLC for Age of Wonders 4, but they also mentioned in one of their dev streams that they're considering doing more content after that. It just depends on how well Age of Wonders 4 continues to sell and how well the expansion packs sell once we actually get the newer ones. Now, another thing that's interesting about that compared to Age of Wonders Planetfall and previous Age of Wonders games is they did very limited number of expansion packs because they didn't want to bloat the game and create imbalances with the newer content. They usually had a pretty clear plan of exactly how many expansions they wanted and how they were going to influence the game before they even released the base game with the previous Age of Wonders games. I think Age of Wonders 1, 2, and Planetfall all had a plan for the number of DLCs that they wanted, whereas Age of Wonders 4 was a little bit more open ended. They were open to continuing development past the normal point because of the way they structured the game, the way they just kind of allowed you to um, mix and match different elements of your character during faction creation, just allows for them to, I think, support the game past the normal point. All right, so now let's take some time to compare the numbers we're seeing for Age of Wonders to Stellaris. Stellaris started off with a peak of about 68,000 players, which is the highest all-time peak that we see here. Over time, it started to look like Stellaris might become more popular in a similar way that Civ has just become more popular, and it looked like its peaks were actually going to cross the initial peak of 68,000, but they never actually got there. And unfortunately, I think the last few years have not released very great content compared to the earlier years of Stellaris. So a lot of people have just stopped playing it. I know that's the big reason why I don't play Stellaris anymore. I haven't seen a lot of interesting things out there that make me want to come back to the game. And in general, it's just an older game now, and there's more modern feeling games that do similar things in a much more enjoyable way. But there's still quite a significant number of players playing this game. Like there's still 24,000 concurrent players playing the game across, well, on average there's 24,000 players in Stellaris in November of 2024. And while the 24-hour peak is slightly lower than that, it's still relatively high compared to the numbers we were seeing for Age of Wonders 4. And then it's quite a bit higher than what we're seeing for Planetfall. But yeah, just to remind you, we had up to 40,000 at the initial point of release, and it got up to a little bit over 10,000, not quite up to 20,000. I guess you could say 15,000 right in between the two is a good estimate for what Age of Wonders 4 got up to. But yeah, just hopping back to Stellaris, that's just below this line. across the lifespan of Stellaris. So in general, Stellaris is still like a more popular game, but the trends are showing that this thing is becoming less popular, and I think that that means that it might not get supported as long as Age of Wonders 4. Kind of hard to know what the developers are actually thinking, but it is interesting when you compare these games because I do think of them as relatively similar. They're both 4X's, they're both published by Paradox Interactive, and yeah, I enjoy them a lot. They're kind of one's sci-fi, one's fantasy, but I think that the way they handle their concepts makes the games actually play in a very similar way. And then the other thing that we haven't looked at in too much detail is the numbers for Civ 6, which had an amazing initial release. It had its all-time peak of 1,000 and 160,000 when it first came out in 2016. And as I mentioned earlier, its peaks after that for new content never got to the same level, but it does look like the game is picking up players as time goes on. And this peak that we see here for new content of 80,000 is actually fairly close to where the concurrent number of players just sits at on average across a month of game time. Of course, the 24-hour peaks they can be a little bit lower, but right now it's weekdays, so I'm not too surprised by that at all. All right, and there was one last thing I wanted to mention. I've noticed that my views on my Age of Wonders videos are slightly up this week. That might be in part due to the new Ways of War content. That might be in part due to the free weekend, and it might be in part due to the fact that I've been hanging out with other Age of Wonders 4 content creators, and they've been shouting me out on their channels. So I wanted to thank everybody for just being around and helping out. And yeah, I'll see you around. Have a good one.